Hi, everybody, and welcome back to yet another cracking installment of the Matt Brown Show. This is the Built in California series, and with me on the line is an incredible founder, an incredible visionary, and his name is Anil Paryani, and he is the founder and CEO of Amp.tech. I see there. I saw what you did there.
Yeah.
I did it.
Perfect.
I did it
You
first
did
time. There was not even a rehearsal there,
it.
bro. So that's great. Well, look, thanks for being here. You're a real jet setter. So just for everyone's information, it's been tough to nail this man down. So, and it's because he's a true legend of the field. So Anil, if you would be so kind as to just kick our audience around the world off with a bit about your background and maybe touch on some of the stuff there that you did at Tesla, and then share with us a bit about the origin story to AMP.
Yeah, appreciate it, Matt. And thank you. I'm relatively a modest person, so I feel like we've all had some contributions to society. And I think sometimes I feel I get promoted, but there's many people I've worked with and have many heroes that I would love to acknowledge at a later date. But acknowledgments are very boring on a podcast. So let me just cut to the chase, tell you a little bit about myself. Just um, perfect pronunciation. My name is Anil Paryani. I'm CEO of AMP. Some people call us AMP, and we are solving energy poverty. And I feel like there's three reasons in an ideal situation on why we work for a living if we're so blessed to. Like one is to be able to do something that you enjoy. I tell my kids, if you do that, you never have to work a day in your life. If that thing that you enjoy also gives back to society, so you leave the earth and the world or your workplace better off than you inherited it, you have a sense of fulfillment. And the third reason is to make money. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll
Yep.
stop right there.
I'll come back to that. Let me just take a note. So, so let's talk about AMP. What would you say? Well, I mean, you know what it is, but what is the problem that you guys are solving? Because it's quite a unique position or take on sustainable energy management.
Yeah, so people don't realize this, but there's actually in the news, um, in this the paper today that sometimes I read the digital version of LA Times, and it talked about what's going on with the solar subsidies. And ironically, there's some environmental groups against this. And right now, the problem that they're talking about is equating cost of energy amongst all social status, users in society, which is super important. But what's also not typically talked about is the amount of curtailment of solar energy that happens every single day in parts of the world. And particularly, I'm in California, and there's some places, sometimes of the year, particularly around the springtime, where there's enough solar curtailed that could have charged 200,000 electric vehicles for free. And what really bothers me is when we don't solve the root of the problem. So part of the question you asked, AMP, we're here existing to solve what we call energy poverty. Now, traditionally, this has been third world, but with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and Europe, and even if you look at recent uh, hurricanes in Puerto Rico, there's wildfires in California, and there's occasional winter storms in Texas. We aren't also that well off in the US as well. So, right now, AMP, we have some technology related to vehicle to grid to be able to utilize the energy from solar and wind that's curtailed instead of just shutting it down or making really bad political decisions to not give the right incentives to have a carbon-free society. What we want to do at AMP is basically unlock that ability to absorb energy, which is thrown away, and put it in the vehicle's battery pack that you already buy, and be able to have a situation where you can charge for free.
Mm-hmm. So that's quite interesting in and of itself because one of the things I was learning about you guys was that when you think about like a battery management system, like you would think that and I guess where I'm going with this, Anil, is to get very clear on like what it is that you guys are actually doing, because it's not about battery production, it's about the energy management systems around electric vehicles or EV powered, assets, if you like. Is that correct?
That is correct. Interesting enough, hardware manufacturing being in California aren't really areas of interest by traditional VCs. We have VC backers that we call hard tech investors, where they're used to investing in some sort of hardware solutions. Now, we haven't gone the full, fathom in building an electric car. Some companies are trying to build battery packs. We're really focused on electronics and software through partnerships. And what you had stated, I'll just kind of round it out. We call it energy management. And what's unique about us is taking in onboard charging and battery management aspects on a vehicle, driving down the cost so more people can have electric, and not just electric cars, but we could say electric buses, heavy duty vehicles, but all the way down to scooters. And those electric devices have energy storage built in. What can we do to make the charging, we say, bidirectional, so it can charge the pack when the sun's out and there's a lot of solar, but then when the sun goes down, be able to discharge some of that energy back to the grid to support the grid in a clean and very low cost manner.
Mm. One of the things I saw on YouTube over the weekend was this, to put what you guys do in perspective, is there was this short video on YouTube. I've got it up for everyone. So if you're listening to this, head on over to YouTube and subscribe, because we're showing stuff all the time. But basically, what I'm looking at, Anil, is essentially a scooter graveyard that's out in China, and there's probably like 100,000 scooters with batteries that are just literally now sitting in aisles and aisles and aisles and rows and rows and rows of, just
Yeah.
dead waste, which is, I mean, I'm sure you agree with me, like that's a real cluster, you know,
Yeah.
of a problem. Whereas like, and one of the things that what your solutions can do is it's not about like the battery management system, it's also about the ability to extend the life of batteries through more effective energy management solutions, right? So you wouldn't have this situation where there's 100,000 dead scooters because the batteries are dead, as an example.
Yeah. I was getting my hair cut, and my barber was like, "I'm anti-electric vehicle," and then I looked at her and said, "Like, why?" And she said, "Oh, because there's a big hazardous waste problem when batteries are at end of life." And I think pictures like that uh, definitely um, stick in people's heads. And they're like, this is creating a problem rather than actually solving a problem. And I think what's happening, especially on the scooter world, and we all look at, you know, um, around the city centers, a whole bunch of unused scooters maybe kicked to the side. And there definitely was a lot of oversupply in that market and a lot of bad product that got put out. I think what Amp's trying to do, and I just so maybe with uh, my barber just basically said, this should happen with the proper battery management system. That battery in an electric car should last for 15 years. In a proper scooter, it's going to last for 5 years. And then, there's a lot of companies now doing recycling. That doesn't quite exist. This because a couple of reasons. One, there's not really any hazardous waste in lithium batteries. People don't realize that lead acid batteries hazardous. Lithium batteries, it's basically nickel and carbon and a little bit of copper. But because they're relatively cheap materials, no one's really come up with a good way to profitably recycle the batteries. But there's a lot of companies' activities. I was just at a conference in San Diego, and there must have been 20 papers on how to recycle lithium batteries. So that problem that you saw is not going to end up being long-term reality.
Mm. So one of the things that I know to be true was something I think Mike shared with me, but he was basically saying like, the current power grid in California cannot support the current EV market. So unless somehow we figure out how to use the power in the vehicle to power the vehicle itself, then this, even though you're going EV, you're actually still putting strain on the power grid. So like, and this is like, that's not a BS. Like that's the current
Yeah.
situation. You're like, and your experience working it, this, right? And so
Yes.
your opportunity is to say, listen, instead of taking all these EV vehicles and connecting them to infrastructure that's already strained and that cannot handle the
Yeah.
capacity, that where AMP comes in is that you guys are developing technology that extends the life of the ability of the vehicle to power itself without having to need a power wall from Tesla, for argument's sake.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. We're trying to, right now, the utilities and others are looking at electric vehicles as a problem. And we're going to turn that around and make that a solution. And just to give you a reference, a Powerwall, I haven't checked the latest prices, but you get about 10 kilowatt hours of energy for by the time you're done, you're spending 15 to $20,000 on that. If you buy a Tesla Model 3 for about $60,000, you have about 5, 6 times more energy available. And by the way, you already bought the car. So not there are going to be use cases for the Powerwall and that sort of business, but we feel that every car should have the proper battery management, charging systems, so we don't have the battery deterioration that's typically associated with V2G, because you're using the battery twice as much as you normally
Yeah, B2G being battery to
would.
grid, right?
Or yeah, V2G, vehicle to grid,
Vehicle to grid, sorry.
is the industry term.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just for your information, according to, let's see, This Old House, credible news source, but the power of the price of a new Tesla Powerwall is 11.5 grand. So I actually went to Park Meadows here. It's like a fancy, like affluent sort of shopping center, and they've actually got Tesla in like a store inside the shopping mall, which I thought was really interesting. And apparently they're like partnering with like Apple, or they have partnered with Apple to help them design these Tesla stores. Anyway, so I walked in there. And I was looking, because I got kids and what have you, so I was looking at I think it was like the Model X. So I want to have a bit of fun with you, Anil. So how sustainable is it actually? Do you know what I mean? Like if I'm dropping 60 grand on a car, and I was having this conversation with my wife, I was like, like today when you buy a product, it's the general trend is like, well, why am I buying this? Well, I'm buying it because it's sustainable, or it's more it's carbon footprint zero, whatever. That's why I buy this brand of food from this person or this company. So if you're buying a $60,000 Model X, say, and then you've got a Powerwall, which it does what it does from an energy efficiency perspective, like how sustainable is it if that 60,000 Tesla times then 100,000 a million? You know what I mean? Like if it's still drawing on energy from the grid, like is it really sustainable, quote unquote, in terms of the motivation behind why people buy these
Yeah.
cars?
Okay. So just to round out the numbers, and it sounds unbelievable. So last 22, we curtailed enough solar to charge 30 million Model 3s, 30 million just in the state of California alone.
Hmm.
So there's not and here's the caveat, that excessive power happens at 2 p.m. during the day. And so where are people at 2 p.m.? They're either working remotely from home or they're typically at work. And so what we need to do is like, and now whether it's Inflation Reduction Act or whatever, local incentives, we need to put the right charge stations to where people are at 2 o'clock. And then these vehicles can freely, we're doing actually the utilities a favor by, it's more work for them to shut off the power than to actually let vehicles charge.
Hmm.
So I just want to let that sink in a little bit. So there's plenty of room to add capacity if we can put the right infrastructure in with the right incentives so people charge in the middle of the day.
Hmm.
And this
Got
is
it.
ironic from like 10, 20 years ago when there was not enough power at that time.
Mm-hmm.
If we can do that with the right solar incentives, so people can, uh, we'll say, co-invest with the utilities and the government, we will be able to work towards a zero carbon grid. And ironically, there are a lot of people who buy electric cars that want to further invest in things like solar power. So we need to have the right policy to enable that.
So, very like liquid markets, especially now, just globally with what's happening. Um, one of the things I'm cognizant of is to ask you: is your market opportunity? Well, firstly, how big is your market opportunity? Because it seems to me it's like anything with a battery is, is
It's
basically your market. So, like,
yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, how
well,
big is this thing? I mean,
yeah,
it's got to be
yeah.
huge.
Well, it's not only anything with the battery, but it's anything that runs any sort of combustion. And again, scooters and even we'll say forklifts to cars, to heavy. And I'll stop at heavy duty vehicles. There's probably like maybe long haul. There's definitely other applications like boating and airplanes, which right now we're not dipping our feet in. But it's over $1 trillion market opportunity. I think 1.4, if I remember right, our investor decks.
So
1.4
it's
trillion.
so it's not that big then. I mean, you've got some room to grow, right?
Yeah. And the nice thing is there's plenty. I have a lot of friends and colleagues from Tesla that I've also uh, done successfully in startups. And so there's plenty of room for a lot of people to succeed. I don't think I need it. Amp doesn't need $1.4 trillion of revenue. Our investors would probably love that.
Yeah, for sure. So what have you built then, or what are you in the process of building? What is the product?
Yeah. So we've been out for 5.5 years. I'll say we started out developing a charging software stack that simply communicated to the charge stations. And everyone who is someone in California ended up becoming our customers. So a lot of the startups, and that was a good way to start with the software only solution. We've also, in parallel, we're developing battery management software hardware systems and onboard charging systems. We have our first onboard charging products on about 15 different vehicles, mostly heavy duty, some passenger car. And what our charging products do is it makes AC and DC charging uh, much easier for the OEM because our solutions are much smaller, can be packaged within the battery pack and solve key functional safety challenges to making sure the battery packs or the wiring doesn't really catch on fire. So that's our immediate products. We are also in development of some really cool. We haven't quite announced this yet. Maybe first time it's going out, but some really innovative cloud-based software for people that are using their own hardware, where they can log in and make sense of the data to give them the ability to control their own destiny in regards to energy management.
Very, very interesting. I think it's a fascinating space, truly, like energy these days. Like healthcare, funnily enough. I think there's probably a direct proportionate amount of innovation going into both, versus, say, financial services, which is like a little bit lower
Mm-hmm.
on the totem pole of hardcore innovation. But curious to maybe understand a bit more around something, well, and firstly around the standards of battery management, because seems to me like if you're in the battery management business, everyone's like a usual thing. You got all these OEMs doing their own thing, their own way with their own standards. You come in with battery management, cloud-based, cool, hardcore innovation products, and then like how do you tackle things like battery standardization when all the OEMs are
So,
doing things a different way?
so I'll tell a story. Um, in 2010, I snuck on what's called SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, Fast Charge Committee. We started the Model S development, and I didn't really ask for permission at Tesla. And usually at Tesla, if you want to do something, you just, at least back then, you just did it. Hold on, I'm just going to grab a sip of water.
Mm.
So I was leading the communication standard, and there were some constraints. The person from Ford said we have to maintain backwards compatible to the older charge stations in the 90s. There was a Nissan contingent that were like, hey, let's use Chatamo because they had spent a lot of time developing Chatamo, which is a Japanese standard brought up by the utilities there. And so started working with those constraints and um, developing something compromised. And somehow the CTO of Tesla, JB Straubel, found out I was on the committee. He's like, Anil, I want to talk to you. And I'm like, hey, JB, what's going on? He's like, hey, why are you on the SAE committee meeting with fast charging? He's all, you're working on the Model S, plus we had a smart EV program. We had Daimler A class, Daimler B class, and by the way, we had Toyota RAV4. So I had 6 vehicle programs, very small team. He's, I'll get off the committee. And I'm like, what are you talking about, JB? Don't you want to come up and lead the standard in electric vehicles that's going to be good for Tesla and good for society? And he's like, no, by the time the auto industry gets their heads around this, we're going to already be moved along and they're going to come up with something far compromised than what we want to do. And so I got off the committee. And I don't know, I think a lot of your audience may drive Teslas. They probably like the Tesla supercharger infrastructure. The handle is very small. There's not this bulk with the standard and features such as like what we call plug-in charge just work more convenient than a gas station. And so JB was right. I'm glad like I had a chance to work with really good mentors. Ironically, because the standard that was developed, I ended up going back 6 months later just to check in how the committee uh, direction, what path they came in, and I realized 2 software engineers from Daimler and BMW took over my spot. And being software engineers, they wanted to create a lot of sophistication and flexibility, and so they came up with something. Sorry, I'm going a little deep, but it's a very interesting story. Power line communications to communicate over that backwards compatible line communications that the Ford team didn't want to abandon. So we have this power line communications that ended up becoming so hard to do. AMP right now is one of maybe 5 companies in the world that know how to communicate between a battery management system on a car to a charge station. And
Hmm.
so JB was right. It was very complicated and sophisticated. Ironically, it's been a benefit for AMP because of that complexity. We're one of the only companies in the world that can solve the problems for the OEM car makers.
Very cool. Very, very cool. How does it make you feel when you can say, like, you are one of the only companies in the world that can solve something pretty hardcore?
You know, well, in this case, AMP, we can get a lot of customers and we can make a little bit of money. We're not making a lot of money on this, but it's actually a disservice to the industry that the charge communication standard's so hard. Because if I'm a heavy duty small EOEM, it's really hard to actually fast charge. And so it is a disservice to getting electrifications out. Ironically, AMP is benefiting from that complexity. So I got mixed feelings about this. My environmentalist, I wish the standard was much simpler. Me, the businessman, the CEO, is happy it's so complicated and sophisticated.
Mm. So, be amiss to not ask you this, but how do you approach innovation? You know what I mean? Like with something like you just like with what you just mentioned, or
Yeah. Well, in
with
this case,
everything
it
else you're
was,
doing. Like, how do
yeah, I
you?
think there's 2 things. I think in this case, when I was at Faraday Future, we solved this problem by spending $1 million on a supplier and adding a $20 Linux controller. So immediately, because of my experience, I saw there was a problem. And when we started AMP, I'm like, hey, we have a really creative way to solve this. And that's why every California EOEM uses our software stack. There's another side of innovation that I think a lot of tech engineers tend to have, and maybe even some business CEOs, but it's that light bulb moment that happens when you're in that deja vu between awake and asleep, maybe around 3 o'clock in the morning. And all of a sudden, your brain cells work in a weird way. And sometimes things that become obviously and apparent, but no one's thought of, becomes the pathway to reality. And so those are my 2 ways. innovating. I think I have about 34 patents. I ironically, I probably think about 30 of the 34 was like kind of ideated at 3 o'clock in the morning when my brain was just working at warp speed.
So you suffer like me.
uh, yes, but kids ruin my sleep. I think since I was able to come up, yeah, I always slept one eye open, and then
Haven't you
maybe
found
that's
that though? Like, isn't it interesting? Hey, like, so my kids are, I don't know how old yours are, but mine are like 8. Well, in fact, 7. Frank's turning 8 next month. But yeah, and then because of all like the disrupted sleep patterns, like I always had, like, so they wake you up, but then I can't go back to sleep. You know what I mean? Like I can fall asleep
yes,
quite easy, but it's like, but now you've woken my ass up now. Now I'm awake. You know what I mean? So then you sit there at 3 a.m. and it's like, well, what am I supposed to, what am I
yeah,
supposed to do with my life
that's right.
at 3 a.m. in the morning? Well, let me just come up with a new design for a patent pending solution for any, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. For those listeners who don't have kids, like, yeah, once you have kids, you sleep with one eye open. It's really weird.
And now it's the same. Now it's like even if they don't wake your ass up, now you're just
Yeah.
up at 3.
Yes.
It's ridiculous. Anyway, another conversation for another time, I suppose. So this tweet went out with President Biden, which I thought was quite funny, but also I think relevant to this conversation. So, by the way, I'm loving Twitter right now. I don't know if you are on Twitter, but basically, uh, Biden tweets the following. He says, "We're building 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations across the country." And then he says, "The great American road trip will be fully electrified." And then Elon chirps in there. He goes, "Or you can just buy a Tesla."
Yes. Yes.
um, what, when we talk about that idea of like the electrified road trip or this shift from natural fossil fuels to sustainable energy production, and when you think about what you're doing and what the public sector is doing from a stimulation perspective, I know there was this massive bill that went out, but like, is the is enough being done from a stimulus perspective in this space? You know what I mean? Because when I talk,
Yeah.
there's
So,
like, there's Elon and Tesla, and then there's you guys. You know what I mean? And then there's like a few other people innovating, but it's like where's the rest? You know? Because it's like
so
that response from Elon kind of sums it up. It's like kind of like you're a bit
yeah.
out of touch with reality.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but let me bring it back to my opening statement. Having the government invest in charging in the right spots is super important. Fast charge infrastructure in between major corridors is very expensive to bring high power cables to those spots. And it's very hard to do that in a sustainable zero CO2 fashion. So and I think this is the fallacy to, let's say, American car ownership. Everyone buys, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm a hypocrite, but you buy a car for that 0.1% use case when I want to go 0 to 60 in whatever 2 or 3 seconds, or hey, I'm going to tow my boat once a year, or I'm going to be taking a road trip with my family once or twice a year. So that's why we buy cars, and so there's a huge price to pay, not only because the size of cars that society pays, the fuel economy goes down. People don't realize the societal costs of that 0.1% use case. So, given that this is the needs for US to Americans like us to buy these cars, it's a worthwhile investment, like the highway bill that Eisenhower passed. So I recognize this. What we need to also recognize is a small percentage of that funds should be put into workplace charging. So that way it's easier for the grid to support those cars that fast charge.
Mm,
So,
I got you.
so as long as we deploy some of this for workplace charging, some of the bills, and a lot of it's state controlled, they have the fallacy of having those incentives for public accessible charge stations. Most people where they work, it's behind the fence. So
Mm,
there's tweaks to the bills that need to be changed. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of expense and a lot of wasted effort.
mm-hmm.
So that's one point. if you want, I can comment on Biden and Elon. Would that be interesting?
Fuck, please. That's why we're here.
So this is probably more interesting than me talking about me personally in the company.
Take the
Um,
bait.
so so Biden is very much affiliated to the unions, and he's made no quarrels about it. Tesla is not unionized, and they do not want to be for a lot of reasons. For one, I could say there is an adversary relationship between line worker and company that exists that wouldn't be compatible with the Tesla culture that I knew. And basically, everyone at Tesla has a little bit of ownership in the company. So there's a different business culture. And that's why Elon is not excited if Tesla's factory workers unionize. And so Biden's had an event where he invited GM, Ford, and Chrysler and said, these are the leaders of electric vehicle development, and really kind of gave Elon a subtle slap. So Elon and Biden are unfortunately working against each other, and they need to work together. Since then, I think Elon's promoted Republicans, and what's the biggest thing that really upsets me is that this has become so politicized. This is not a Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal issue. This is about energy independence. And I think there's a couple ways to achieve energy independence. And if right now the Republican stance is let me drill, baby, drill, right? The Democrats are like, well, let me build more solar panels and and windmills. And obviously, from a long-term sustainability, CO2, and I will say even costs, especially if you factor in the cost of militarization, of protection of these oil assets in unfriendly parts of the world. It's expensive and dirty to drill oil even in our backyard.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Couldn't agree with you more. It is it is what's not said on a tweet
Yeah,
that provides the context for it all.
yeah. So I gave you
Listen,
my unfiltered. I'm
ah,
not as
and
popular as Biden and Elon right now. It's like it's yeah,
exactly. No,
tell you
that's
how I
good.
feel.
And everybody heard it here first on the Map Round show, right? So, I'm winning here. Cool. So I just want to change gears for a moment and quickly talk about funding. So you guys have closed around of Series A, 17 odd million dollars to fund your next chapter of your growth. So two things. When did that close? I didn't have Crunchbase open then.
Yeah. We closed a few months back.
Okay.
EIF, Ecosystem Integrity Fund, was our lead for a round, and they
Mm-hmm.
are a hard tech investor. Our seed round was led by 8BC, who's also done some hard tech investments in Mike the Boring Company and some battery material companies. Sila is one of them. So we have some hard tech investors, which I definitely appreciate.
Yeah, sure. How did you? What was your experience? So I have like an ongoing, sort of segments on the show where I'm like, hey, like, so you just closed around like 2 months ago. Everyone's like, bitching and moaning about the market and why it's tough, and it is. But what was your experience on the ground? Did you find it easier than you anticipated, or
Yeah,
you
it
know?
was much harder, especially in the space that we have of hardware. And I'll just kind of get more political, which is interesting. And like finally, I think in the U.S. we're realizing the importance of manufacturing. We have abandoned Middle America, like the West Coast, and has been doing the tech. The East Coast has been financing it, and a lot of these funds to build our products have gone to Asia, and it's come at the sacrifice of manufacturing jobs. So I think the government's also realizing from a security standpoint, this is something that Republicans should gravitate on. It's important that we build things like semiconductors and batteries in the US. However, the best choice, I think, is to have peaceful relations with China. There's been a quid pro quo that's existed where, hey, if you're doing hardware, get it built in China. If you're doing software, we'll do it in California. And those walls have now been broken. good or bad. And so I think if you're doing software, it's still easy, relatively easy to find investors in the US. If you're doing hardware, it is now getting easier because of all the incentives that the government's putting out to build stuff in the US.
Hmm. Very interesting. So I want to have a quick bit of fun with you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So don't worry, you're in safe hands. Um, but so okay, so I'm going to give you the keys to the map around show time machine, right? So if I could give you the opportunity to go back to yourself on day one, 5 years ago, and if you think about all the things you failed at, all the things you've succeeded at, etc., what advice would you give yourself on day one about building AMP or AMP?
So it's interesting. We actually started out doing a little bit autonomous driving, and I wasn't, and this is, I think, my fallacy is I'm not focused in general. I kind of go broad, but I can go deep, and that's what makes me unique. But that focus as a startup, pick that one thing that you're really good at and identify, make sure the market actually needs it. And interesting enough, the market hasn't really needed the autonomous driving, but they've needed the electrification part more. So that part I wish I could have accelerated. We would have been a couple years further along than we are now.
Hmm. So then, maybe to go deeper, to use your words on this journey that you've been on, what would you say has been your greatest failure, quote unquote, and what did you learn from it?
The greatest failure. Uh, okay. Um, I think when it doesn't count till you're in production and when it's real. And to be honest, like the Model S, what comes to mind, there's been a few things that I've taken to production. Ironically, when we launched the Model S, the big battery was great. My side job was managing the 12-volt battery. And the two big failures when the Model S launched were the door handles and the 12-volt battery. And I was doing just the software controls. There were other pieces such as the battery manufacturing quality, which I took for granted, and that ended up biting me in the butt. So, I'll kind of announce it here, let it out. The way Elon works, the batteries were failing. Who's responsible for the 12-volt battery? Anil, no questions asked. Can we replace him? Uh, I think I got moved on at Tesla, like because of that situation. So, and
Mm,
that's ended up being a good thing for me anyway. And obviously Tesla's uh, gone on to success, but I'm
mhm.
taking a little bit different approach than
Yeah,
Elon.
I'm sure you are.
Yes.
Tell me,
Yes.
what are you struggling with now? Like, in other words, like what is occupying your mind as a kind of an immediate issue or
Um,
challenge?
yeah, no, it's exactly the same thing I just said.
Okay.
So we're in our age of industrialization. We have real battery management charging product out there. So first off, um, is it safe? Are we going to have anything light on fire? What we do is very risky if not done, designed correctly, manufactured correctly. And a lot of those pieces we're using outside manufacturers. So having those right checks and balances definitely keep us up at night. And secondarily, um, we're all in on this. And if we have a design defect, which requires a recall because of the hardware aspect, that is a little bit risky. So we've got to make sure, like, we adequately test, validate, cross, all our T's and all our I's in our design. But those things are not easy to solve. And that's why there's only, like I said, 5 companies that can do what we can do.
So, just a quick one on scale. How do you scale something with what you've built? Because it's not like a SaaS product. It's hardware. It's hard science, hard stuff. Um, so how do you scale with a business such as yourself? Do you go through distribution companies or strategic partnerships as a key driver of scale? Because obviously it's not direct to consumer here. So walk us through what that looks like in
Yeah.
your world.
Yeah. Well, we're doing a little bit more. more, as I mentioned earlier, developing some cloud software, and this is being venture backed. All our investors and all investors love software because I could just write some code and type a few keys on the keyboard and it's deployed and can scale. It's a great product. I do think though, and if you look at Tesla, Tesla is a car company. I don't think so. Is it a tech company? I don't think so. What Tesla is a manufacturing company. And people don't ever want to say that because there's not the sex appeal of it, but it's true. And I think for us to basically change people's lives, there is going to be hardware aspects to our business. And so what we have to do is create reusable hardware built by great manufacturing partners, and then we can achieve that proper scale.
Cool. So are there any tools or resources that you use, Anil, to from a performance perspective or from a life management perspective? So books, other resources, practices that you use?
I do read, um, uh, not as much I like, but I read a lot of nonfiction. And a lot of business books. Um, and I don't know if I can, um, uh, let's say, promote one of them. I think there's so much good knowledge out there. And I think being CEO, I have to be that broad and I have to be a information sponge. And so just talking to other leaders and reading a wide variety of books, I think really helped me. And on the internet, and I think maybe I'm slightly guilty of this, but my attention span is a much shorter. So, um, and the internet really, um, advertises towards that short attention span. So I don't know if I have one book that I can definitely promote, but I think as a leader, it's important to like definitely read, and even I'm reading stuff on the economy, trying to think, stuff that I wouldn't necessarily be interested in. Like, hey, what's hearing Yellen on 60 Minutes last night? I'm like, oh my, I gotta watch, see what she says, to see if I can get any insights to make decisions. So,
Mm-hmm.
God, I did a promotion. I didn't mean to. 60 Minutes, pretty good piece.
Amazing. You get into branding at some point. Well, look, Anil, let's wrap this up. One more thing, and we'll let you go. But why do you do what you do? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
um, I really will feel fulfilled if people can enjoy blue skies every day, and this is everyone in the world with very little economic cost to do that. And so I'm really on a mission to end energy poverty.
Amazing stuff. Anil, been a real privilege and a joy chatting to you, man. It's been great to finally get you on the show. And yeah, wishing you and the team all the very best of the future. It's a $1 trillion opportunity, so good luck with that. Don't crash the car, bro.
Matt, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Anytime. All right, guys. Thank you. Ciao now.